When do you know it's time to bring in a professional? When you're talking about something that's important to you, you want to see some changes, whether that is in the workplace, perhaps is in your personal life, perhaps is in your career, in your community, and you notice that you might be out of your depth. How do you know? More importantly, who do you go to? Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Time to Come Alive. My name is Valerie Hope. I'm your host. And as usual, every week we have a wonderful opportunity to become even more conscious, get connected with one another, and create something of worth and meaning in this world. And that is the purpose of this show. Every week I have this beautiful opportunity to talk to someone new and exciting, and today is no exception. You'll get to meet her in just a moment. But before that, make sure you go to timetocomealive.com and subscribe if you want to get every single episode in your inbox. You also have the option, if you're watching this on YouTube, to subscribe below, and you will get a notification every time a new episode is posted. So be sure to do that before we continue. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, because I have the pleasure of having met this really fantastic person recently, Brittany Cole. I don't know. I feel like your name has to have that kind of like excitement when I say it, Brittany.
I love
Um,
it.
and I gotta admit, is one of the few quote unquote LinkedIn connections success stories that I can say.
Oh my God, I didn't know that. Okay, you have to share more.
Maybe we don't, maybe not a few, but they're so few and far in between, right? So someone on LinkedIn reached out to me. Her name is Grace. Grace is a mutual connection for both of us, but I don't know Grace. I literally don't. She reached out to me and I somehow just said, yes, let's talk. We had a conversation and she said, do you know Brittany Cole? I'm like, I have no idea who she is. And she said, you need to meet Brittany. And because I'm a curious person, Brittany, and I was just like, what is it so special about Brittany? I need to talk to her. Okay. So
I love that. I love it.
so when Grace was like, "Oh, talk to Brittany," I said yes, and it was so great because it's been what 3 months, maybe 4 months since you and I had our first conversation, the only conversation we had, but we
Yeah.
clicked, and I so appreciate your enthusiasm. I like the bright colors. I like the bright energy, and I know that you work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for that brightness to go paired with a topic that can sometimes be so heavy, I'm like, all right, Brittany, you got to come on Time to Come Alive. We got to talk.
Yes,
Welcome to the
yes.
show, Brittany.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to share, and really, I'm excited just to have another conversation with some eavesdroppers on YouTube and the podcast. So, thank you for inviting me on your show today.
Gladly, gladly. So, what else should we know about you? I know that you live in Nashville, Tennessee, but what else should we know?
Yeah, so I am a native of Nashville, born and raised here, moved away, spent some time up in New York for a bit with work. And in terms of my corporate background, I spent 12 years at Pfizer doing everything from sales to marketing to diversity and inclusion work. There at the time as kind of additional projects, helping to support some large initiatives across the organization. And through that work, I believe really became more aware of my life's purpose of really, really wanting to live in this space and really have more impact in this area. And so I actually just recently, relatively recently, took the full-time leap into entrepreneurship last August. So it's just so amazing to think about what a difference a year and a half ish almost makes. But yeah, I'm thrilled to share more about who I am. I'm a daughter, I'm a wife. I grew up in a home where I was the youngest and only girl. And one quote that I often remember my dad would share with my two older brothers and I was that the biggest room in our house was the room for improvement. So I kind of live by this motto of continuous improvement. And so really grateful to get to live in the space now, leading an inclusive leadership development firm.
The biggest room in the house is the room for
You can tell us
improvement.
that. It has
That
stuck to
sounds
this day.
shady. Dad was trying to throw some shade. Wow. Biggest room. I like that though. That was actually quite clever. because
Yeah,
it makes it sound like it could be an inspirational, like success story poster,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it
yeah.
really is kind of like you're not
Like,
doing
celebrate
anything.
the wins, but it's like, "Okay, you brought the B home, that's great. How do we that's great. How do we get to the A?" You know? So
Ah, that's fantastic. Okay, so you mentioned those 12 years at Pfizer, you got to do some things and work on some projects that help you uncover and move towards your purpose. So what was that exactly? What was the tell? How did you know that you were tapping into a purpose thing there?
yeah, so I would say, my corporate career, it was an interesting journey. So I actually started, like I like to say that I grew up in corporate. I started out as an inroads intern, was my introduction into Pfizer. So I was on this cute, neat little pre-law track. I had studied political science and communications and was planning to go to law school. And through my internship, was just kind of awakened to this pharmaceutical industry and really enjoyed my time as an intern and came into the organization in sales. Really enjoyed the work. There was always this thread of training and development. So even when I think back to, my early career years, taking on projects, leading training and doing a lot of things, without maybe the title of manager, but that was work that was highly visible, helping people to elevate in their space. And so that transitioned to me being extremely curious around marketing, just wanting to understand the business and understand the way that decisions were being made in terms of why sales were doing the things that we were doing as more kind of the execution piece. So really coming in house, relocating from Tennessee to New York and really understanding the strategy there. I believe for me, that experience really showed me it was the first time that I worked in an office setting. So the 9 years prior to that, I'd always worked in the field. So I
Mhm.
always say like sales is the closest that you get to entrepreneurship with the safety net of a salary, So coming into the office setting, I started to see a lot of things that people talked about in terms of just the culture and office politics and the implications of being the only in the room and what that means and really even the weight of that. You mentioned the heaviness of DEI work, and so I started to experience a lot of that during that time, but also saw opportunities because I was in headquarters to connect with and really create opportunities within that space to make the culture better. And it was really through that work that I said, hey, I want to do more of what I was doing on the side. So I had started my business in terms of coaching and speaking professionally, but really saw an opportunity to add value in terms of just the programming, curriculum development that I was doing at Pfizer on a larger scale as a business owner. And so for me, it was the perfect kind of marrying of what I believe is my gift of speaking, my love of leadership, just my energy and passion around professional development and being able to bring all of those things together to help improve culture at companies so that everyone believes that they belong in the space where they work and spend the majority of their waking weekday hours brings me a lot of joy.
Good. That's fantastic. Now, here's what I want to know. So, what were you working or dealing with at Pfizer? And not, not to reveal any company secrets, but what were some of the situations, knowing that you're in an office environment? You mentioned the politics, the culture, like things that you hadn't been privy to in the field. What were you noticing in that space where this gift or this expertise that you wanted to bring all of a sudden had a resource or had a need?
Mhm. Yeah, so I would say one of the first areas of awareness for me was that as I was working in the field, I experienced a lot of the same things, but I had these moments of reprieve because I wasn't, kind of bombarded with this very real fact that I was even the only on the team in the field.
Let's
But because
define that for a second because maybe
yes,
people are listening like the only did I get did she get cut off? The only
yeah.
what exactly?
Yes, yes. Thank you for clarifying that. Like, I talk about this all the day. We get it. Let's move along. So yes, the only Black woman, right?
Okay.
So the youngest. So from in terms of generational diversity, on many teams, the youngest on the team, and then also the only Black person on the team and only Black woman. When you kind of overlay the impact of intersectionality on the work and lived experiences of diverse talent. So those things really showed up in a more pronounced way when I moved in house. And I would say for me, in terms of, what that looked like, you know, it started out as small things. So, for instance, I'm coming on to a new team, moving to a new city, taking on a new role. And in all of this newness, having conversations with my manager where we just were not gelling initially and thinking, okay, is it me? How do I flex? What do I need to say the next time? Like, I have this value of continuous improvement. So what do I need to do to get better? And then really kind of coming, through a lot of conversations, coming to an awareness of, perhaps it's not just me. Perhaps there's another dynamic, that's going on here that's making, our working relationship challenging. I would say also it was an awareness of, talking to other colleagues who didn't look like me and understanding that, there was this sense of discomfort and even maybe, I don't want to say not anxiety, but just level of awareness that, hey, we have a Black woman on our team, and maybe this is something that's new for us. So, is there something that needs to be different in terms of how we interact with her, and just being able to have some of those conversations that were initially uncomfortable, but that weren't just thoughts that were going through my mind, but understanding that those were also considerations that my teammates were having as well. And then I would say the last thing in terms of just the impact that that has sometimes, particularly for Black women in the workplace, is that you kind of start to question, your ability, and you start to kind of have these thoughts of self doubt. And so for me, it was just around kind of reaffirming that, hey, I'm at the table. We like to use that analogy, because I deserve to be here, and I'm capable of doing the work here, even though I made this transition from sales into marketing, and I have something of value to bring. So I need to speak up and use my voice, and lean into all of the things that made me successful before, even though I'm in a new space and experiencing a different level of challenges every day.
Interesting. This I want to go peel back maybe this whole idea of the you mentioned how to interact, how people now had to frame their interactions with you, right? Because not only are you the only person feeling being the only woman, the only Black person, the only Black woman in the group, but also their experience like, oh, I might need to shift how I perceive or how I listen, how I speak. So I want to go way back, take it all back.
Yeah, let's
When
let's
was the first time that you felt that you were, or you noticed that you were the only person of color, or the only woman, or the only, like, when the being the only person mattered to you? Can you remember the first experience?
Yeah, that is such a great question, Valerie. And I would say for me, the first gosh, the moment I just thought of, I'm like, no, I had an experience before that. I would probably say, so it's something that many people may not know about me, but I grew up taking dance. And
Uh-huh.
like when I say dance, I mean like tap, ballet, tumbling, and jazz.
Hmm.
And so I can remember going to shop for the tights to go up under my leotard with my mom, and having a conversation about why the tights looked ashy, because they were nude, but they were, a pale nude. They weren't brown, so they didn't match my complexion. And I can vividly almost remember her trying to navigate the conversation without, maybe saying, some of the terms that we may say now, around why products, don't fit everyone. But I remember that moment of, pink leotard and then looking down at my legs, her legs, in terms of her tights match her arms. Why don't my legs, match my arms? And I would say that's probably one of the early moments of me just recognizing the difference relative to race.
And how did your mom navigate that conversation? Like, clearly you ended up buying it tights, it sounds like. so, so what, yeah, what was the outcome of that conversation? Or at least, if not for her, for you?
Yeah. So, for me, I think, early on, the outcome was that, this is what's available. So we do the best with what we have. But it doesn't mean that the tights don't look great on you or that you don't look great in the tights.
Mm,
So this idea of, which I believe has shifted somewhat now in terms of, the implications of what that means in a work setting of, um, you know, I would say, my mom's generation prioritizing assimilating,
mhm,
in terms of your identity and the way that you show up and the way that you look, even small things like wearing my hair like I, have it today, she'd probably say, press your hair before the interview because, straight is more in line with the culture when she was in the workforce. And so I think a lot of those beliefs early on were things that my parents made me aware of, and then very early for me, through inroads, having that as a competitive advantage. But it really was an organization that was set up to help Black professionals, young Black high school students at the time, be successful and be prepared for the workforce and the implications of perhaps being the only Black person within a corporate setting, and what that meant and how you needed to show up and what executive presence means and all of those things, and jargon that we are very aware of now. But there were things that I was trained on as a high school student, college student, that perhaps my white counterparts weren't even thinking about.
Interesting. I this whole idea of the the generational assimilation versus what would you call it now? It's so if the game back in I guess as a baby boomer, your parents were baby
Mhm,
boomers likely,
mhm.
yeah. If
Yes.
that was if assimilation was kind of the name of the game, what would it be today?
I believe it's authenticity today. And so
Oh,
people want to be able to show up and bring their authentic self to work, whether they like to wear their hair straight or whether they want to wear their hair curly, or whether they want to wear it straight and curly on the same day. So whatever that authenticity means for you, knowing that you work in an environment that embraces that, where you can be exactly who you are and who you choose to be, is definitely where we are today.
that's so funny. And I laugh because I think as a black woman that hair it becomes is a thing. Hair is a thing. It's such an integral part of our being, of our upbringing, and probably a lot of it had to do with this notion of assimilation at an early age. So the messages that we heard then versus now sometimes kind of rub up against each other. Like
Sure.
my latest authentic flex is gray. Gray is the name of the game for me because I'm like, you know what? It's too much work. It's too much
Rocket.
work. My body clearly wants my gray is a sign of the time. And so I'm just embracing it. And it's been a few years now that I haven't done any coloring or any of that. And I'm actually quite satisfied with it. My goal is to be like to look like the Oracle, the Matrix.
Love it.
Hillary.
I'm not quite there yet. I'll have to tell you, I've got a lot of gray up in this region, and I'm like, a little rinse every quarter or so does me good. Just keep it all black. Let's keep it all black now.
You're probably a little younger than I am too. So yeah, after a while,
but,
it just
but
gets tough.
but by the grays that I naturally have, thanks to my dad, he grayed early too. You would think, and like, how old is she? She got a little gray going on.
That's your dad's fault. My dad's fault too. He's all yeah. He has white hair, and so but I love that. Yes, the distinction between then and now is this idea of embracing authenticity. So let's talk about you. So I think that's probably the most interesting way to approach it. Aside from your hair, we know that the gray hasn't quite been embraced at the same level, but that's okay. It's coming. When you
Working on it.
think about how you've embraced your authentic self as you've navigated all these different professional environments, what did you notice was being birthed or you were exhibiting as you became aware of where you wanted to be more authentic?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I have so many thoughts on that question. So I would say for me, particularly during my career transition of working in New York and working in marketing, you know, I started to really embrace that I have this gift of speaking, and not just speaking in terms of like sharing information, but speaking in a way that connected people, and helped people to understand and be able to digest topics and content that may be more complex.
Mhm.
And so I started to lean into that. So very practically, I joined Toastmasters at Pfizer when I was in marketing. It's
Well,
like,
I didn't join Toastmasters at Pfizer's, but I am a Toastmaster as well.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So I started back with Toastmasters, and I started getting these requests to come and share with other groups. And so probably one of my favorite memories during that time was getting to come and share our business strategy that our like 2 weeks prior, our CEO had shared across the organization with a department. I'm like, wow, you all want me to like come and share, the new strategy for the organization, and leaning into those moments. And what was so kind of illuminating during that time, Valerie, is that none of that was a part of my like job description, right? So it was all of
Mhm.
this stuff like, hey, will you come and do this? And like, what do you think about this? And we want you to be a part of this conversation. And can you help us, plan this strategy and lay out this curriculum? And I just really started to notice that, hey, there are these things that I do, very naturally in other areas of my life that aren't necessarily registering here in terms of my day to day, my 9 to 5. I'm being asked to do them in other areas. I'm saying yes and staying open, but I want to live in that space. And the feeling of being in a space, particularly for me as a woman of faith, where that you're gifting and you have this just feeling of being able to execute and embody a level of authenticity that you don't experience except when you're in that space. And it's not that you're not authentic in other areas, but there's this depth of it that happens when you're operating in that zone of genius. And, for me, it's like, how do I live here? I want to experience this as much as possible and not, on the weekends or, on the side. Like, how do I, say yes to this and make everything else the extra? And so, for me, it was, okay, can I do that here? And although I think down the road, I probably could have at Pfizer, it didn't look like an immediate option for me. And so, it really challenged me to say, hey, if this is really what you want, and if you believe it, you've got to bet on yourself first. And so I took a leap of faith and decided, to do that and build my company.
So you went off and did it on your own rather than actually doing it with Pfizer. Interesting.
Mhm.
So, but I want to go back before we go to your leap.
Yes.
We go back to your leap. I want to know, what was it about this diversity, equity, and inclusion field that drew you in? It's one thing to be the only Black woman or be the only Black person and feel like a beneficiary, or perhaps even have a level of contribution into the conversation, and another one to take the lead. So what was it that inspired you to do as much as you did in that space?
Yeah. So I'll say a couple things. Definitely the personal connection with it, was obviously there. Being a beneficiary of that kind of work in terms of even just my own career advancement, it was why I was at Pfizer. Inroads made that happen for me, where I had never considered working at a company like Pfizer. So I had that personal connection. But then I would also say, I saw a need and a gap in terms of, and it's so interesting to be talking about this now, because the real secret is when I started Career Thrivers, I swore we were not a diversity and inclusion firm. Like, we are a leadership development firm. We do leadership. This is about leadership. This is not about diversity, equity, inclusion. That's a part of it, right?
Hmm.
So there are all of these things that have evolved this year. But in terms of DEI work, in terms of kind of the traditional, consulting, strategic planning kind of process, I saw a need because most of the work that I saw in-house at my organization at the time, and when I researched other companies that were doing the work, it was very much tied to human resources only.
Mm.
And HR professionals are brilliant. They're great. I get to work with some awesome HR professionals now in the work that I do. But I believe if the goal is to cultivate a culture at an organization where people have a level of psychological safety, where they believe that they belong there in their full authenticity, that work requires everybody, that it can't just stop with HR and the annual or semesterly or even quarterly training, but to really have an integrated solution, you have to have every business leader a part of the plan and every team member, meaning the whole organization that's a part of it. So with that in mind, I had to get over even some of my own, I mentioned, self-doubt and negative thinking, imposter syndrome around, well, I'm not an HR professional. Like, I don't come from that world. So, Brittany, what can you bring to this work? Because most of the work is aligned to HR, at most organizations. And that's really where I would say I had an awakening last year of just recognizing that, I come from a commercial background, I come from a business lens, and that differentiates me in the space. But it's also what I believe the space needs, right? To help companies really cultivate a culture that's tied to leveraging difference as a business imperative, right? So that, people within an organization don't feel like this is the flavor of the month shiny thing that we're doing, on the heels of the media and tragedies across communities, but that there's an integrated company-wide approach that includes but also extends beyond HR.
Mm, I like that. Leveraging business is a leveraging difference is a business imperative. So why, first of all, why do you think this always or seems to land in HR's lap as the imperative?
They're the people industry, and this work is very much about people. I would also say, when we look at where DEI work originated, it started out of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, very, punitively. So, as a result of Title VII, companies started then to implement D&I training. At the time, there was no E for equity. It's like, there really was no I. It was like, diversity training, as a way to show that they were not discriminating on the basis primarily of race. But, EEOC, we know race, gender, um, age, sexual orientation, etc. So, because of that, most of that work ends up being not only HR, but also legal,
Mhm.
because of the legislative implications of that. And so I think that origin of the work, historically has been met with the HR team and the legal team leading all of it, and it becoming more of a, mandate, check the box,
Compliance.
compliance, right? Something that we have to do versus an integrated part of how we live, breathe, and work at the organization.
Mm. And what have you noticed has shifted or has had to shift in order for it to land across an entire organization, not just human resources or legal?
In one word, I would say accountability.
Say more.
So much like, and I always, again, I lean on my business background, and I lean on sales. So if you are in an organization that has sales representatives and has sales managers, you set a goal for the organization that is based on a usually at least a 5-year strategic plan,
Hmm.
right? So you know exactly where you want to be in terms of you have a vision. You set a black and white plan that says, hey, here's a strategy that's aligned to this vision. And then here are the tactics and goals, or the goals, and then the tactics that are going to help us get there to close the gap between where we are today and where we want to go. Then, in a typical sales organization, you communicate that out to everybody. Everyone's on the same sheet of music, everyone knows what we're doing. And then you say to the managers, hey, for your slice of the pie, in order for us to reach this goal for everyone, here's what we're holding your team accountable to. Here's the number or the behaviors, etc. And this is a part of your performance plan. So we are holding you accountable to your part in this bigger picture, this bigger pie, and getting to this North Star. So we do that, right? We embody all of the skills from a business standpoint that I believe are necessary for effective D&I
Hmm.
strategy within a workplace. And so for me, and I say this, and oftentimes when I'm talking to your group, I'm like, okay, everyone brace yourself. We've already committed that we're going to be, we're okay with being uncomfortable. That's a part of this work. But DEI work isn't hard. It's like we do this stuff in every other area of the business. Why do we, skip over or think that we can go around, or, we can put out a statement but not have any action behind the work when it comes to, the people. And so really kind of helping to draw those similar skill sets that we embody in other areas of the business within DEI really helps leaders to understand that we have to have a clear plan and a vision for where we're going. So why is DEI important now? And where do we see the company going and growing as a result of being more intentional in the space? What does that look like? Meaning, what is the data? So we don't have just, oh, let's do unconscious bias training because we heard that's great. but what is the data driven strategy by which we recognize the gap in getting to an inclusive workplace? And what are the skills that our leaders first need to build to help close the gap? And then how do we hold them accountable to the
Mm.
action behind that work? And so for me, that's really, what's needed, and what I mean when I say accountability in the space.
Interesting. So these what you're pointing to is that people have leaders have all these different skill sets, expectations, metrics that drive pretty much every other business decision that is made, the
Yep.
product lines that are sold, the way that the sales team is distributed, like all of these things. But you notice that there was a gap in how they were approaching DEI, not
Mhm.
using some of those same tools, resources, and approaches. Now, why? So as you're bringing this in, right, you're bringing in this idea of embodying strategy, this 5-year plan, et cetera, and executing it throughout the organization using DEI as the right the what you're disseminating. But what did you know or learn about why people were not approaching it that way from the get-go? Like what was missing, or what was, yeah, what was the gap there?
So I would say, one of the big ones, there are many. So again, I'm like, I have like three answers in my head. Um, one, I do think that there's this aspect of leadership. And let me be specific, the leader. So the CEO, the
Mhm.
executive director, the president, the leader being involved with and invested in the work.
Mm.
There, one of the greats in terms of, companies best, that best practices that are great in the space, is Sodexo, that have been doing the work since the early 2000s. And actually, just in May of this year, they were named by Diversity Inc. as one of their Hall of Fame companies for diversity and inclusion. And they spent in 2002, so they set a D&I learning strategy that spanned about 6 years. And they spent an entire year, and maybe, I don't necessarily believe that we're here in 2020, but in 2002, they spent a year aligning leaders along the business case for diversity and inclusion, and making sure that their leaders were on board, connected with, involved with, and invested in the strategy that they would lay out. So I think that's one, right? Usually, especially in big organizations,
Yeah.
oftentimes what has happened is that you have these amazing employee resource groups, or ERGs, that do fantastic work, but it's very grassroots. And not only is it very grassroots, it's not sustainable, because the same people that are driving 95% of the action relative to diversity and inclusion, and I can speak to this because I lived that life. um,
Were you an ERG baby?
Yes. Oh my goodness. And it was, and it got to a point, and again, it was like, I love this. Like,
Yeah.
I love it. We're building out great programming. We're seeing people get promoted. Like, this is amazing. Oh, and by the way, I also have a $20 million marketing budget that I'm responsible for. So on the weekends and at night and early in the morning, I'm trying to lead this, DEI project. So where's the investment?
Mm.
Right, becomes the question. And so I think from a leadership perspective, that's one. The other thing that I'd be remiss if I didn't say was that, particularly when it comes to racial and ethnic diversity, just the impact of our history in the U.S. specifically, in terms of not addressing our history, and not embracing the discomfort that comes with just this is what happened, and we can sweep it under the rug, and we can tell certain parts of the story, but the facts are the facts, and understanding the systemic dynamics that keep homogenous teams the same, and in place. And I think it is an important part of the conversation as well, that has gone missing a lot of times in the work. And then so I would say those two things. It's got to be more than just a grassroots effort. You have to have that leadership investment and involvement. And then you also have to address, the core and the source of the challenges. I was sharing with a group earlier today around, the differences between diversity, inclusion, and equity. And of course, diversity, it just means difference. It's difference that we can see, difference that we can't see. It's a fact. We
Mhm.
have difference. But inclusion is the act. So inclusion is when you are intentional about incorporating that difference so that people believe that their voices are heard,
Mhm.
regardless of their level in the organization. And then equity, which, in my mind, is the goal. It's when you have outcomes that aren't determined by the difference that you see. So then the question for equity becomes, what are the conditions that have been created thus that certain groups are promoted more, are heard more, are seen more than others? And I believe if we never get to that question, if we never tackle the source of the sameness, then we end up with more of the same. And we just end up with, projects and initiatives that aren't sustainable in terms of cultivating culture.
The source of the sameness. What is most rewarding for you now? Because you've just said that you were a part of, and it seemed very enthusiastic part of the grassroots efforts, right? Leading an organization or a small group of them into doing some of this work. But now in your work and career thrivers, really seeing that is really the leadership across an organization and the strategy that has to be implemented and the data that has to drive the implementation and all that. What would you say are some of the moments that are the most rewarding for you in the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, so, I had one yesterday.
Oh, do tell.
Yeah, so I did a talk for a big company corporation here in Nashville on allyship and gender bias, and the CEO was a part of the conversation. It was, an ERG, so their women's ERG hosted this event, and the CEO was a part of the conversation and shared some opening comments. And one thing that I didn't know is that he ended up staying on for my keynote longer than, I thought he would have time. So maybe a week and a half later, his chief of staff reached out and was like, hey, he'd really like to connect with you and schedule a one-on-one. So I'm like, okay, great. Let's do it. So we get on the phone this week, and Valerie, I have no idea what he wants to talk about. Like, there's no agenda. We have an hour together, which, for, a CEO of a large corporation is a lot of time. So I'm doing my due diligence in terms of, being prepared for the conversation, but, I really don't know. So
Uh,
I get on the phone, and the first two questions that he asks me are related to, personal work experiences that he has had with his leadership, where he is aware of a lack of gender and ethnic representation, and what I think about how he should handle
mm,
these two challenges. And for me, that was rewarding, on a couple levels. One, I was honored that he would ask me. Like, I'm thinking, like, okay, he wants to know. I don't know what I thought he wanted to know, but I'm like, he wanted my, advice on how to
mm,
handle, a situation relative to the space that I work in. So I was pleased by that, but also just to hear the way that he's thinking about, their new business strategy that they just unrolled. They have a 2050 vision for the company, and how DEI has to be integrated into that, and in their shift in terms of their business strategy from, product company to solutions company, that they have to make this shift in the culture, and what that looks like, and how he's thinking about it, and what are the gaps that I see, and what am I seeing from other organizations. Just to have a leader at that level asking those kinds of questions and thinking holistically in that way, I mean, it about made my week. So
ah.
yeah, those moments are definitely rewarding when you have leaders that get it, and they're willing to make an investment in the change that they want to see.
Absolutely. Talk about accountability. I mean, a few weeks before having heard the message and whatever it was that you said that really sat with him to then have a conversation and reach out. Okay, so we have to know, what advice did you give him? What did you tell him? You don't have to reveal the name. You don't have to say the
Yes,
organization, but we want to
yes,
hear, what did you tell him?
yes. So we had a couple conversations, right?
Okay.
So one was around, he had some challenges understanding and just kind of, thinking through why women oftentimes after they decide to start a family either decide not to come back to work, or they come back to work and may be hesitant to take on more leadership opportunities. So he had gotten called out in a session with a broader team around his implicit bias in thinking that way. So
Mm,
we talked through that, and I was able to share, just some insights there in terms of, here's oftentimes why this happens, in terms of, economic factors. So the pay gap is one of those reasons. When you have a family that's growing, in a household, I think a very natural question is, who's making the most, continues working, and oftentimes who's making the least, has to stay home. And even in 2020, I believe I'm not going to get this exactly right, but it's somewhere in the range of 70 to 80 cents on the dollar that women make, in 2020 versus men. So there's that, that we talked about. But then we talked about just the historical perceptions around gender roles within households. And that being a large part of the bias that is then replicated within organizations that keeps, women from raising their hand, but also keeps both women and men from being good allies for women to be in leadership roles. And so that was the other thing that I shared with him when we talk about this idea of allyship. It's not just about male allies, but it's also about women being better allies for other women, as well. We talked about likability bias. He brought up Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election, which I thought was so interesting. I mean, we literally talked about just about all of the like, don't talk about subjects.
whoa. Talk about psychological safety, right? To have reached out. That's phenomenal. Okay, so what was the outcome of the conversation?
I have a
If you can share.
Sure. Yeah. So I have a follow up with his VP of Learning and Development to do a training on the history of DEI, with his leadership team. So
Mm,
we're going to kind of get into some of what we were talking about in terms of just, the other insight he shared was just, uh, especially coming from more of a global background. He's not a U.S. native, and so just not understanding why some of the conversations, just like we were having, he's like, I don't understand why I can't have this conversation with, a large group here at the company, and why, there's so much tension, and so we talked through that. So just helping his team kind of understand the history of some of this work, and also the historical implications in the US on the work. And so I'm really looking forward to that. And I also invited him to join my podcast. So
yay!
so
Excellent.
stay tuned.
Excellent. No, I get what I'm hearing there too is that, as you're talking about this level of accountability that really, in order for this to be an effective movement, let's call it a movement, right? For it to be an effective movement across an organization, having the leadership all the way across the top and be completely invested and accountable to it, some of that has to be addressed. Like some of the leaders might have some discomfort, whether it's discomfort because they don't see it, they don't understand it, they don't care for it, which is fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with not like, I don't feel invested in this particular conversation, but I'm clearly being asked to do otherwise. How do I reconcile that? Like
Sure.
the fact that he took advantage of your skill and your ability to have that conversation in a safe way, says a lot about where leaders could go. Because I think that's a piece that might be challenging. It's like, how do
Mhm.
you reconcile knowing that you're leading and there's certain things that are expected from a leadership perspective, or there's certain things that are expected as a responsible organization that
Mhm.
that they do or not do. How does one as a leader, whether or not they personally believe or don't believe or agree or disagree, right,
Sure.
how do they show up knowing that they're accountable to the entire organization? So that's fascinating. I'll be interested to see, and maybe if you watch Brittany's podcast, you'll see exactly who she was talking about. Ooh, we're gonna, by deductive reasoning, you'll be able to
Thank
find
you.
out who was
Yeah.
he. So we know non-native you. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Delete, delete, delete. We
Delete,
want to
delete, delete.
maintain
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
confidentiality. Yes. That's fascinating. Okay, so on the flip side, so that's one of the moments that you said that really helped you, feel that success, or really found that fulfillment. what are now, knowing what needs to be done or where you see there are greater opportunities, what are some areas that concern you or some areas that you feel a little bit weighed down by?
Yeah, so I am always, just it always tugs at my heart when I hear from, professionals who are having challenging experience in the workplace. In the panel I was on earlier today, there was a young lady that had put in the chat, that she's their first at her organization, she's the first Black woman hire, and how she feels tokenized and why that is, and how she can bring that up and kind of how she can facilitate a conversation. And, for me, those stories are too common. And, so one of the ways that I try to still, work in that space is I still do, private coaching. And so I still do coaching in terms of just really helping with that side of the equation. Because before I was flipped. So before I was doing, all coaching. So it's like, okay, let's talk about your personal brand. Let's talk about how you're showing up, how you're communicating, how you're asking for the salary, how you are speaking about your experiences in an interview. But then you get the job or the promotion, and then go into the team with the leader that is, let's just say, mediocre. So it's like, okay, how do we solve for that in terms of career thrivers? But for me, it's still um, creating opportunities to provide that coaching and support and resources for women of color, professionals of color who are still very challenged by just their reality and how they can navigate, whether they're trying to advance their career and move up, or if they want to stay where they are and just have a better experience.
So for you is really that personal, the individual's limitations or discomfort or being able to expand them and having
Mhm.
those one-on-one conversations where you can make an impact.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of that to be done, I'm sure, in so many different fronts. And I think for
Yes.
me, what I've always, struggle is not the right word, but I've always been trying to navigate. My family, we're immigrants to the US. And you and I talked a little bit about this. I don't share, in our family, we don't share the generational trauma that most African Americans experienced. And so our conversations look a little bit different, sound a little bit differently, but I feel like there is still a responsibility, right? As a human being, like who do I need to be in this space, and how can I support what needs to be supported? And I've always, even as a woman, I'm the only girl. I have three brothers, so I've never felt like I'm like, of course I have a seat at the table. Get out of my way,
Right.
that I was brought
Same.
up that way.
Same.
Right, so I've not had some of the same challenges that I think as a society have kind of come to light. All of the women figures in my life have been not only strong in terms of resilience, but also big hearted and contributors. And there's always been a level of value. There's always a value add energy to what they've done and how I was raised. So I struggle sometimes and like, well, here, how can I support and how can I show up, not to overpower and not to like just do what I do, but really more about how can I create the space for people to know that, oh, I can do more or be more, or all of us can shine the way we're all intended to
Mhm.
anyways.
Yes.
Maybe we just have to polish things up a little bit or get out of somebody's shade because we
Or build your
forgot,
own table.
or build your own table. Boom. Exactly. Exactly. So no, I really get it. I think a lot of what you're sharing so much leads back to the personal work that one has to do in order to get to where they need to go. So what kind of personal work do you do for yourself that keeps you shining, keeps you, hoping and working towards something better?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. And so I used to really champion, oh, the coaching that I do is aligned to professional development, and it's all over, and it's like, personal development is inextricably linked to that work. You really can't do the professional without the personal. So, for me, practically that looks like, my morning time, as I like to call it. So, whether it's right now, I'm reading an amazing devotional I'll share with you all. It's called
Mhm.
Believe Bigger. It's a devotional journal. So whether it's, a resource like that, whether it's meditating. Funny story, I actually learned, if you will, how to meditate riding the subway in New York.
That's the perfect place to do it. Perfect.
Like, I have learned how to quiet my mind because if I don't learn how to do this, I'm going to go crazy with all of these people touching me for 25 minutes in the morning on the way to work. Like, let me learn how to just zone
Oh,
out.
serenity now. I love that. Okay, perfect
So
place.
whether it's meditating or even going out for a hike, I mean, just making sure that there's a daily practice
Mm,
of, now the trendy term of self-care, but I think, that's really, become a habit in terms of how do you ensure that you are, at your best so that then you can bring out the best in other people,
mm,
and be there for other people and serve at your highest. And so I really believe that there's this really strong connection between self-care and service. A lot of people see it as, oh, well, I'm being selfish or I'm taking time for me. And it's like, no, you need that so you can pour out of your overflow, and not just the little driplet because you are burnt out, because you haven't made time for yourself. And so I try to make that, a daily non-negotiable, that happens in some way, shape, or form.
I love that. Yeah, so no driplets here, everybody. We must give from the overflow. Let's
Yes.
get to the overflow. Well, Brittany, as we're wrapping up here, I know you have also recently authored a wonderful book. So tell us about the book and where can people find it?
Yes. So my brand new book is called Thrive Through It.
Show us,
It's
show us, show us.
Oh, yes, it is. Here it
Drive
is.
through it. Is your favorite color yellow?
It has become my favorite color. I just think it's so vibrant and like I think it really like speaks to, I try to like raise people's energy and like, elevate people in that come into my space. So I like
All
that.
about the sun. Okay. Well, wait. Bring the book back. Bring the book back. Hang on. I was just commenting on the yellow because I saw it.
Yes,
Thrive through it. Okay. A guide for redefining resilience in life and business.
yes.
Fabulous. Well, first of all, congratulations
Thank
on
you.
being published here. And tell us where can people find it and who should be reading this book?
Yes. So you can check out the book details about it, at thrivethroughitbook.com. So you can go there. It's also available on Amazon. And I really wrote the book for people who, may be struggling through loss and, who may be going through, a transition or a change or challenge. You may not even, recognize that you're struggling, because you may be, suffering in silence. I think so often, has been my experience. It's like, you show up in this space similar to what you were describing. It's like, you got to be strong and you have to, really show that you're resilient in this moment by, proving that you've got it all together and that you've got this. And not although you may not always feel like that's the case. And so, for me, this book is really about helping to really redefine and reframe the way that we think about resilience. We typically, liken resilience to bouncing back, and I don't necessarily believe that we bounce back. I don't think that if we're, even if we take the pandemic, we're not bouncing back. We haven't bounced back,
Mouse forward.
but we feel exactly, exactly. So, for me, it's about how do you extrapolate the lessons, through your losses, to really reimagine a new perhaps vision for your life, and to reinvent in a way that helps you move forward. And so, that's what the book is about. And yeah, you can learn more at thrivethroughitbook.com.
Lovely. Well, I'm so fascinated, first of all, by the energy that you bring to this conversation. Of course, I said this this transition that so many people are making, internal and then also at the corporate level. It's a big one, and it has, right. It comes in waves. Of course, this isn't the
Of
first
course.
and only time any of this has ever happened. I think we're constantly elevating the conversation, the upping the ante, if you will. And you said, this idea of the past generations really about maintaining a status quo in some cases, or just getting a little bit. I saw Chris Rock and Trevor Noah. Trevor Noah is my celebrity crush, or one of them. He
I
and
can see that.
Hassan
I can
Minhaj.
see that.
Something about funny men from other countries with intelligence. But they were having a conversation about the ask. That was really interesting. So Chris Rock said, back in the 60s and 70s, we were just asking for the wrong things. Like, why would you want to ask to sit at the counter? Nobody wants that. Give me money for my school. Like,
We're asking for the wrong
it's like
thing.
that. We're asking for the wrong thing, he said, or at least back then. And the way he says it, of course, Chris Rock's he
Yeah.
always has a little a different perspective, but I could really get that back then that was the ask.
Mhm.
And today, what you're asking for, even what you said earlier, this idea of having an organizational wide a process, a strategy, intentionally focus on all leadership getting on board and finding a way for every person in that organization to touch and impact this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion. That's where it's going, right? So it's not just about, oh, hire more people, have HR do this, and then check the box that compliance was met. Now is like, how do we, like you said, really have that the business imperative front of mind. So I appreciate your perspective. I appreciate your energy around it. I think I'm sure good things are coming your way, and if
Thank
this
you.
leader is worth his salt, he'll continue having these conversations with you and taking the
Yes.
actions. So good. Anything else you want to share as we close, Brittany?
No, thank you so much again for having me on your show today. I definitely enjoyed our conversation, and as I always share when I leave conversations, I believe thriving is a mindset, and it is best done together in community. So let's thrive together.
Thriving community. You heard it here. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Time to Come Alive. Remember, go to www.timetocomealive.com and subscribe so you get this in your inbox, or right here on YouTube, you can subscribe and get a notification when our new episodes are posted. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.